Hi, everyone. Welcome. Jacob, I'm going to pass it to you now to start letting people in. Thank you. Amazing. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Just going to give it a few more minutes to let everyone in, and then we'll get started. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and get started. We are recording, so if anyone joins late, I'll let them know that they can go back to the beginning. But thank you all so much for joining for this session of JCC Association's 8 Guiding Principles on Inclusion. This is the 3rd webinar in this series, and our topic today will be the principle of Negeshut, accessibility. Just a note, closed captioning is available at the bottom of your screen if you would like to enable that. And we will be sending out the slides being presented today after the presentation. So you don't need to take notes or anything unless you really want to, but you will have access to all of these slides afterwards. So my name is Sierra Weiss. I'm the Access and Inclusion Specialist for JCC Association. I use she, her pronouns, and I have white skin, curly brown hair, and today I'm wearing a navy cardigan. And I am in my hometown of Newton today, Newton, Massachusetts, for our webinar, which is the traditional land of the Pawtucket. And just want to acknowledge my colleague, Liv Mendelson, who is not on screen with us today, but as always has been a major help in putting this all together. So a shout out to Liv. And I'm very excited to share the screen with some amazing people today. We will have 2 JCC highlights this afternoon, Beth Mitchell from JCC of Central New Jersey and Naomi Kramer from the Miles Nadal JCC in Toronto. So they will both give presentations, and then we'll do a short Q&A with them. And then Rabbi Lauren Tuchman will be joining as well for a presentation to all of you, and then we will wrap up. So the principle we are talking about today is Negeshut, accessibility, and we defined it as we are deliberate and mindful about the environment we shape. As our tradition teaches, you shall not insult the deaf or place a stumbling block before the blind, from Leviticus 19:14. Starting from where we are, we look at how we can shift our policies, communications, programs, processes, and facilities to increase and enhance accessibility to JCCs and their programs. And in SOF, we do not finish. We always strive to become more accessible. JCCs strive to actively seek to identify, remove, and prevent barriers to full participation and to become more accessible by learning about and practicing inclusive design. So I am so excited today to first welcome Beth Mitchell, who is the Director of Inclusion and Diversity at the JCC of Central New Jersey. She is responsible for driving thoughtful design and creative execution of programs and services that celebrate diversity and break down barriers to community inclusion. Beth's career as a speech-language pathologist has spanned over 17 years, and she has served individuals with disabilities at every age and stage of the life cycle, making her uniquely qualified to lead the agency and community at large in inclusive programming, ongoing education in the dynamic, ever-changing world of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion culture. Work is important to Beth, both personally and professionally, and she holds several certifications in this arena. Beth has an incredibly extensive background, and there is even more to her bio, but I am gonna let her take the floor now because I don't wanna take up any more of her time because she has so much incredible work to share. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Beth.
Thank you so much, Sierra, for that very generous introduction. It's really an honor to be asked to be here today on behalf of the JCC Association with my colleagues, with all of you. And I'm just thrilled to be able to share my experience with you and hope that it is helpful to your work. So today we're talking about how to open doors when everything is closed. That was my personal experience. And we're going to be talking about inclusive programs and services under this pillar of accessibility. So these are just a smattering of some of the individuals that we serve every single day. And this is really the heart of our JCC. So I just wanted to be able to put some faces to our programs to give you a visual overview of why we're doing the work that we're doing. So a little bit about me. As Sierra mentioned, I am a speech language pathologist by trade, and I was hired by the JCC of Central New Jersey in March 2020, 2 weeks before the pandemic hit. So I was charged with working from my dining room table and creating a department from the ground up. There was nothing in existence, while simultaneously homeschooling my 2 kids and my husband at home and the dog barking and all the things that we all encountered during COVID. And I began to think to myself, how am I going to create this department? How am I going to create opportunities that are accessible while we are in quarantine? So I had a couple things available to me in my dining room table. I was fortunate enough to have worked and lived in the community that I'm now serving. So I had lots of professional contacts from my speech pathology days. So I used those contacts. I certainly had space to dream and use that paper and pencil to write down ideas. I had Shelley Christensen's book, From Longing to Belonging. If you don't know, this is a fabulous resource on Jewish inclusion. Shelley is actually the founder of JDAIM. Definitely check out this book. And lastly, we had the power of virtual communication. So those were the things that were at my fingertips. And I wanted to sort of provide you with a roadmap of where I started with this agency and where we have gone today. So if you're new to the world of inclusion or you're looking to expand programming and services, the first step, as you all know, is engagement. You really want to strengthen those internal relationships at your agency and even in the community at large. Constant staff training was tremendously important as we started to solidify and expand our inclusion programming. So I did a ton of staff training virtually, which actually was working out really well. People were engaged. And due to all that training and relationship building, we had a significant and observable mind shift within our agency. The second step was for me to conduct an agency audit to identify not only the needs of our staff in terms of their knowledge and comfort level in supporting with people with disabilities, but also to assess the needs of the community and the people that we're serving. So we did an audit of our agency and of our community, mostly through online platforms. Something like SurveyMonkey would be appropriate. And we took that information and examined it and thought about the ways that we could create programs to meet those specific needs. So from that, I was fortunate enough to be given this magic wand to create. And we were able to create some tremendous programming that I'm going to go through in a minute while we were in quarantine. And it was very successful in helping us to create a base of people that would be interested in our programs and services. Again, I turned to my staff colleagues to help market some of these programs and to work together to create programs that were accommodating and accessible. And then, of course, the last step was to then reflect and measure that impact, especially as we emerged from the pandemic. So this was not without hiccups and challenges. As you can see, I think we all recognize that this process is not always smooth, but the process itself also has value. And when we take the time to notice some of those bumps in the road, we can really adjust and have a larger impact. So So I'm going to go through some of these programs in greater detail, but as you can see, we offer a wide variety of both programs and support services that really were created with minimal barriers to accessibility. And if there were barriers, we find a way to make accommodations to make them user-friendly. So I'm actually going to start with our early learning program. So we have a full service infant through kindergarten program. We are a Chevre Cornerstone school, and we're built on the Reggio philosophy. What's interesting about this program, this year we have 260 children enrolled, and of those 260, we have 35 children who are somewhere in the process of being identified as a child with a disability or have already been identified. So that's a significant percentage of our kiddos. We work together through something we have created called the HESED Committee to provide training and resources to our staff. And this has been extremely helpful to give our staff support. And we also collaborate with a number of professional providers as well as parents. So this is one way that we foster inclusion at our agency. It's very purposeful and mindful. We have an after-school program at the JCC, which is also an inclusion model. While this program does not necessarily provide staff support, we absolutely partner with families and will help them bring in a one-to-one support person if their child needs that level of care. This year, we opened a brand new program called Club Connect. Through that agency audit, we identified that there was a need for after-school program that was accessible for teenagers and young adults with disabilities. So this is a program that is run by a special education teacher, a speech pathologist, myself, and a social worker. And it offers just an incredible opportunity for these teenagers to engage in a community setting, engage with peers, and learn how to function independently in a community center. We have two incredible programs that I'm very proud of in Camp Yachad. Our shadow program is running now 21 years, and this program provides a one-to-one support professional for campers with disabilities from ages 2 all the way up through 8th grade. The other program that we offer is really meant to be a transition from our shadow program into young adulthood. This program is called the Skills Training Program. It is the first program of its kind in our area to provide paid, supported vocational training to young adults and teenagers with disabilities. They are offered mentors, and it's really an incredible opportunity for them to work alongside in a supported environment with their peers. The reason I say it's the only program of its kind is because typically when some of our young adults are placed for supported employment, they might be placed at a location like a ShopRite or a Marshall's. And those settings just do not offer typical peer interaction. Very often their peers or colleagues, coworkers would be much older than them. So this is really a setting where they are seamlessly integrated into our camp family right alongside their peers. So we're very, very proud of both of these long-running programs. We offer several different options in our fitness and wellness suite. We have an adaptive swim program. Our swim trainers are Swim Angelfish certified. Our personal trainers, several of them have been certified through Special Strong. And we also offer seasonal adaptive yoga classes, certified specialists in yoga for the special child. This is truly where that partnership with your professional colleagues comes into play. So while there is, certainly a component of outreach on my end in reaching the folks that might be signing up for these programs, our adaptive swim, personal training, and yoga classes are offered by the specialists in those areas. So that's where you want to start having those conversations with your colleagues about, hey, what can we do in aquatics? What can we do up in the fitness center to be more accommodating? And that's really how I suggest going about it, by starting to create those solid relationships. Certainly, we had to build a level of trust to get here. And we also had to provide significant training through some of these programs. And, it's been very well received both by the public and by staff.
Beth, thank you so much. I'm going to have to interrupt you there, but I know you have a few more slides and we'll make sure that everyone gets to see them.
Absolutely.
And you'll all have a chance to ask Beth a few questions if you have them after we have one more presentation by Naomi. And if you have any questions that you just thought of for Beth and you don't want to forget, feel free to write them down or put them in the chat and we will answer them in just a few minutes. So thank you so much, Beth. And now I want to introduce Naomi Kramer. Originally from upstate New York, Naomi Kramer has been involved in the JCC movement since she was a young child at both the Schenectady and Albany JCCs in summer camps, after school, and swimming lessons and swim team. After earning her master's in chemical engineering from McGill University, she moved to Toronto in 2008. She has worked at the Miles Nadal Jewish Community Center as the aquatics manager, prenatal and baby wellness manager, Jewish Life Special Events coordinator, and now is the director of operational and program excellence. During her tenure as aquatics manager, Naomi had a strong focus on staff training, consultation with partner organizations with expertise in inclusion and accessibility, and an engineering approach to problem solving to make the aquatic center at the Miles Nadal JCC accessible and inclusive for all. So I'm gonna now pull up Naomi's presentation, just bear with me. Okay, and Naomi, I will give you the floor.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sierra. So today I'm going to specifically be talking about accessibility in our aquatics department. And so if you don't mind moving forward to the next slide, that would be fantastic. Perfect. So sort of the way I always approached accessibility in our facility it was ticking off a few boxes. So one of the pieces was infrastructure. Another piece is strong partnerships. Another piece is staff training and education. And then another piece is creative engineering solutions. As Sierra mentioned, I am an engineer by training and therefore a natural problem spotter and problem solver. I love to approach each challenge and see if I can find a way to make things more comfortable for people. And so delving into the next slide, there is a picture of what our Freddie Shore Aquatic Center at the Miles Nadal JCC used to look like before we had a fairly major generation. And some of the pieces that I want to point out, so we always had, or recently had a chair. It's kind of hard to see. It's sort of in the top right corner of the pool. Sorry, my video turned off. My internet is not super stable. So we always had a chairlift to allow people access in and out of the pool. But some of the pieces that we didn't have, there was no ramp in order to enter the pool. And even though we had that chairlift, there were people for whom they wanted sort of the dignity of entering on their own without assistance of a motorized feature. And a ramp would have been a great way for them to be able to access our pool. Another thing I want to point out is, and it's a little hard to see here, but all of the tile, in particular the floor tile, was a single color. And so that made it kind of challenging to see where the edge of the pool was. And quite frankly, the color is pretty dull there. So it's really hard to see. The lighting in the center itself was fairly dim. It doesn't look dim in this picture because it just so happens that the picture was taken in a moment where there was beautiful afternoon sun coming in. But generally speaking, in the early mornings and in the evening, the center or the facility itself looked a little bit dim. Obviously safe enough for us to lifeguard appropriately, but still not the best lighting. And then another piece was the echo off the tiles. Now, anybody who's been in a pool facility knows that they're very echoey. Tiles tend to bounce sound all around. And I don't know if you can tell from the picture, but we had acoustic baffles put in. Those are those panels that are sort of hanging down to try and absorb some of that sound. But it was a very echoey space and very tricky for people with any sort of sensory sensitivity. So if we can move forward to the next slide, in fact, maybe 2 slides. So So as we were approaching the renovation, we decided to consult with a focus group that was comprised of some accessibility experts and people with lived experience to give us a sense of what are the things, since we're doing this renovation, that we should think about, install in order to make our space more accessible. And so this is a picture of the renovated space. Some of the features that I want to point out: we did install a chairlift again. Initially, we didn't, because we had installed a ramp, which I'll talk about in a moment. And we thought, okay, great, people can access the pool with the ramp. But we realized we really needed both options to give people multiple ways to access our pool. So we installed a chairlift, and then, as I mentioned, we installed a ramp. With that ramp, we also purchased some water wheelchairs, because many people's wheelchairs probably shouldn't go into pool water. And so we had this option for people to be able to enter the water with our water wheelchairs. We also purchased walkers that were possible to go into the water, and all sorts of things that way. That way people could keep their own possessions without chlorinated water on them. Another thing that I wanted to point out is, you can't see it here, and you will see it in a future slide, but we installed color contrasting tiles to allow people to see where the edge of the pool was. We put in a bit of a lip also, so you could actually feel where the edge of the pool is. And so that allowed sort of a visual aid that way. The lighting is much brighter. It doesn't necessarily look brighter in this picture, but this picture was actually taken at a moment where we didn't have beautiful sunlight coming through, and it looks much brighter. The lights we install are supposed to sort of mimic daylight, which is much better for sort of seeing your way around the facility. And then we install acoustic panels all around. You can't even really see them because they kind of blend into the walls, and the pool is still echoey, but less so. And so that helped sort of reduce that intense sound of being in the pool area. So moving on to the next piece, talking about community partnerships. So I want to talk about Holland Bloorview Kids Rehab Hospital. I was first introduced to them when I attended an aquatics conference, otherwise sometimes known in the industry as a swimposium. And I heard a speaker from their organization talk about inclusive and accessible swim lessons. And she came in showing all sorts of equipment and all sorts of methods in order to teach lessons in an inclusive and accessible way. And I was hooked. I didn't have a background in any sort of inclusion or accessibility, but I formed a relationship with this particular staff person. We would bring her in for training for our staff. We would go to them for training, and we really tried to learn from each other. So they've always been a really, really great resource for us. Liv Mendelson started working with our facility. I actually can't remember when she started with us, but one of the wonderful things she brought in as she started to work with us across the entire Miles Nadal JCC was an opportunity to have other partnerships. So she brought in Autism Ontario. We started a relationship with the Down Syndrome Association of Toronto. And so this afforded us opportunities for sort of experts to turn to if we had any questions, and for training opportunities. And last but not least, the Canadian Red Cross has always been a really strong partner for us. And I'll talk a little bit about what their partnership meant in the next slide. So in terms of staff training and education, and I heard Beth talk about this, it's super important. We worked really hard to have accessibility and inclusion focused training. Now, in our aquatics facility, we would have quarterly in-service training. So in the pool training, all sorts of aquatics things like lifeguarding drills and things like that. And we made sure to incorporate at least once a year, sometimes twice a year, some sort of accessible swim lesson training. And so again, this was an opportunity for us to partner with Holland Bloorview and to bring them in to help train our staff. And we even had the opportunity to do a train the trainer kind of training with them, where our own staff could then turn around and train internally. And so we really prioritized having more knowledge in how to teach inclusive and accessible swim lessons. I also listed dryland training for anybody who's in the aquatics world. Dryland training is anytime, you know, you're outside of the pool. And so I mentioned Autism Ontario and DSAT, Down Syndrome Association of Toronto. We would also do training with them. In particular, I remember a training we did with Autism Ontario where they did a focus on easing transitions for our students with autism, which was fantastic training and quite frankly was great methodology to use for all of our students to ease all transitions between different activities for our students. So we really prioritize training and training from experts. Now, the Canadian Red Cross has certain swim levels, and it didn't really work, the evaluation process, for all swimmers. And so working with Holland Review and some other facilities throughout Canada, they created this adapted aquatics program. And the big difference is the levels were all the same. The difference was in the evaluation process. And so that process changed in that there were a series of questions that you, as an instructor, would ask yourself about your student in order to assess whether or not they should complete a level. And so what I mean by this, for example, if the skill was that they need, the skill they needed to do to pass the level was flutter kick with pointed toes, and the student was somebody who was an above the knee amputee, they of course would never be able to do flutter kick with pointed toes, with that leg. And so the evaluation process changed to, is the spirit of the skill being completed? If it's yes, then the next question was, is it safe to complete that student into the next level? And if the answer to that is yes, then we were able to then complete a student in the level that they were being evaluated in without having them complete the skills in the same way that the original evaluation process indicated. So that was a really transformative way for us to evaluate students and be more inclusive. And then last but not least, our creative engineering solutions. So initially we had a swim guide program where we matched low vision and blind swimmers with volunteer swim guides. And it was wonderfully successful. The challenges were, though, scheduling. If the swimmer and the swim guides couldn't find a time that worked for both of them, then they weren't able to swim together. And so then that was very limiting for our swimmers. And many of our swimmers voiced this desire for greater independence. So once they had learned our facility, if the pool was the only space where they needed sort of this assistance, it really limited what they were able to do. So looking at the next slide, we implemented in consultation with one of our swimmers a sprinkler system. Effectively, what happened was we purchased sprinklers for either side of the pool, and we installed them with hoses. And then when we would turn on the sprinklers, the water coming out of the sprinklers was a bit colder than the water in the pool. And so as the swimmer would reach the end of the pool, of the lane, they would feel this colder water sprinkling down on them a little of the pool. So this system was fantastic. It was easy to implement. It was easy for the user, and it was low cost, and I'd say fairly creative, and it allowed for more independence for our swimmers. And also I want to point out, as promised, you can see a better view of our color contrasting tiles that I mentioned previously. So I'd say all in all, our approach of training, creative problem solving, having proper resources, trying to have the infrastructure that we need to support accessibility that made our facility even more accessible than when I first started at the Miles Nadal JCC. So thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Naomi. I'm going to stop my screen share and I'm going to turn your camera back on and pin Beth as well. I see we have one question in the chat that I will ask for our audience, and then if anyone else has questions that they want to ask, we'll spend about 2 or 3 minutes on questions here and then start our next presentation. So the question, This is for you, Beth, from Gary Baumser. Can you share more about the staff training you provide and what training do you do with parents?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I wear two hats at our JCC. I work in the inclusion realm, and I also oversee all of our diversity celebration efforts. So we do multiple trainings every year around these topics, both as a full staff to create that community engagement, and also to set an expectation of inclusion staff-wide. And then I also design and create staff training specific to each department, because truly inclusion looks different at the pool than it does in early childhood. So part of our needs assessment was figuring out what the staff needed, where their strengths were in terms of knowledge, and where their needs were in terms of those gaps. And my trainings tend to focus on addressing those specific gaps identified in each department to help give tools to make that department more successful. Parent training. So I actually created a new program called Parent Pass. It's Parent Advocacy and Support Services. This program is geared towards giving parents education around, in this case, New Jersey special education law, so that they can then go back and advocate for their child's needs with their district or their school system, their teacher. We also work hand in hand with our parents in terms of facilitating a very thorough intake process before they are accepted to any of our specific programs that are geared towards inclusion. And we get to know our kids that way, and then we schedule a follow-up call with the parent. But truly, these conversations with parents typically are going on all year round. And I think that we really pride ourselves on creating those relationships, both with our staff and with our parents as partners.
Wonderful. Beth, Naomi, thank you so much. I am going to welcome you to stay on. And if anyone else has any more questions for Beth or Naomi, please feel free to put them in the chat and they can respond, or we might have some time at the end for them to share some more responses. Okay, and now I just need to find Rabbi Tuchman. Here you are. I'm going to put you in the spotlight and let me just share my screen, and we'll move on to our next presentation. Okay. So our featured speaker today, who I'm so excited to welcome, is Rabbi Lauren Tuchman, a sought-after speaker, spiritual leader, and educator ordained by the Jewish Theological Seminary in 2018. She is, as far as she is aware, the first blind woman in the world to enter the rabbinate. She provides consulting to individuals and organizations across the Jewish community on a variety of matters pertinent to disability access and inclusion. She has taught in numerous synagogues and other organizations across North America. She was named to the Jewish Week's 36 Under 36 for her innovative leadership concerning inclusion of Jews with disabilities in all aspects of Jewish life. In 2017, she delivered an Eli talk entitled "We All Were at Sinai, the Transformative Power of Inclusive Torah." Rabbi Tuchman, it is my pleasure to have you with us on screen. Thank you so much for joining us, and I will let you take it from here.
Thank you so much, Sierra. Good afternoon to everyone. It is an honor to be here with all of you, and it's a real honor to be able to follow these beautiful presentations that we've just heard. And I'm going to be focusing a bit more abstractly. So we've heard really beautiful presentations about inclusion efforts for JCCs, and it's so important to hear the concrete actions that are being taken. And I'm going to pause and do a little bit of a deep dive onto one of the most important aspects of this, which is Negeshut, or accessibility. Now, I want to just say a couple of things about my style. I am a very auditory presenter, so I am not able to look at the chat when I'm teaching. If there are questions or things that needed to be repeated, please put them in the chat. We will have plenty of time for Q&A. I really want to hear from all of you, but I just want everyone to know I am a very auditory presenter. So just putting that out there for folks. I don't have a PowerPoint, but I'm happy to repeat anything that needs repeating. So with that, what exactly do we mean when we say accessibility? And as you've already heard, the disability community is multivocal. It is extraordinarily large and with very different needs, including within specific disability communities. So I speak as a woman who's totally blind, and that is my primary disability identity. And that's where I am rooting my understanding of accessibility, but I also go beyond that because we know that accessibility is something that is very, it's non-static, it changes all of the time because our needs change and our world changes. And that's where I want us to start. We are in a totally new reality. And I often think when I'm talking to colleagues and I'm talking to folks in the field, and I think to myself, do we need to even just start over? I don't think we do, but I do believe that we are in a very different world than we were 2.5 years ago. And we know that the pandemic has had an outsized impact on disabled people, on people with disabilities. I use identity first language, but I will be going back and forth between the two, between person first and identity first language. We know that this pandemic has had an outsized impact on people with disabilities. We know that that's true of kids. We know that that's true of special ed teachers. We know it is true of adults with disabilities. We know it is true of families. We know it's true across the entire spectrum. And we're just in a different reality. And yet we still are yearning for inclusion and acceptance in society. Many people in the disability community, and I think it's important to say this, many people in the disability community feel extraordinarily abandoned by society, by any number of things. It has become particularly true in the wake, I'm speaking in the United States, particularly true in the wake of the lifting of the mask mandate a few weeks ago. That, for many people in the disability community, felt like a seismic shift and really felt like a breaking down of feeling like, now I'm totally being left by society, I'm totally being abandoned. And even those of us who are disabled and are not high risk, which is my category, those of us who are disabled and non-high risk for COVID have been contending with things such as, for example, in the United States, folks who are blind or visually impaired, depending on their degree of visual impairment, have not had access to independent means of COVID testing. We have been working on this for several years. It is still not present in the way that it needs to be, which is extraordinarily, there are a lot of words that one could use to describe that reality. What does it mean to not be able to independently check to see if one is positive for COVID? In a pandemic world, what does it mean to not be able to know if somebody around you is wearing a mask, particularly when the pandemic was really at its height? What does it mean when you can't actually go and get testing because you can't drive and they only will accept people in cars and you end up having to sit on the sidewalk because there's nowhere else for you to go? Those are all things that were reported in recent surveys of blind adults around what they've experienced and what we've experienced during COVID-19. And so I'm speaking to you really as someone who has experienced plenty of inaccessibility during this time, but is extraordinarily privileged in terms of the blind community. I am very well situated. I am very well resourced. There are a lot of things that, frankly, I don't deal with day to day, that the vast majority of the disability community deals with. And even still, there are barriers to access really everywhere. And I think that that's something that we have to really contend with. And so when we think about this in the context of a JCC and creating the most accessible space, part of what that means is when we think about how we make our spaces accessible, and as thank goodness, many of us are able to return to a lot more in-person programming. That is not true for everyone. So how do we continue virtual offerings for disabled folks who cannot be in person and for other folks who cannot be in person? That is part of what it means to do accessibility. I remember, and I found it on my website the other day, and anyone can go and look it up. At the very beginning of the pandemic, I wrote this piece about accessibility improvements. Now we're in this place, we've got electronic access to text, and we've got things on Zoom. And I think about it, I'm like, who was I 2 years ago that I would have written something like that? Because at that time, my perception was, wow, this is terrible. We'll get out of it in 7 weeks. And look at all these amazing accessibility achievements we've achieved overnight, especially people in the blind community, especially adults in the blind community. We've got all these things online. It's great. And I think about that article now, I'm like, oh my goodness, just the utter narrowness of my own perspective, which is why I feel so grateful that I'm in community with people with very significant disabilities who have taught me a lot about how my own perspective is narrow and how inherently my perspective is narrow, because we all have narrow perspectives, which is why, you know, having those advisory committees, which were mentioned earlier in this presentation, is so important of people with lived experience, because my experience as a blind woman is not universal to the blind community. It is my unique experience. And so having as many people at the table as you can is extremely important. And so thinking about, I'm not going to be talking today about what we can do to make our JCCs more accessible on a concrete level. We've already heard some beautiful case studies of that. I'm going to be focusing for the next few minutes on accessibility as a value. Right? When we think about Negeshut, when we think about accessibility as a value, ultimately what we're asking is, who do we want in our building? Who, as we talked about earlier with regards to ramps on pools or that sprinkler system, which I think is fascinating. I've never heard of that, and I'm really intrigued by it, to have mapping for pools, or just any other kind of facility. You know, who is it that we want in our space ultimately? And the thing that I want us to take away, if nothing else for my talk today, is the idea of something called an access conflict. And what is an access conflict? An access conflict is, in my view, an inevitable clash of needs. So, in other words, when you have two people whose needs for access are very different, and I'll give an example that I think can relate to the aquatic example, although it's a little bit different. So many folks know that at street corners, there are often these raised domes, we call them. They're like bumps, and you can feel them underfoot. You can, if you're a cane user like I am, you can feel them with your cane or whatever, but they help orient to where the crosswalk begins and ends. And for me, I love them. They're great. They are physical orientation objects that are immediately accessible. But I have heard that for some folks who use wheelchairs, they are an obstacle. That is a direct access conflict. We obviously want curb cuts because we want accessibility for people in wheelchairs to be able to move around freely. And as a blind person, I want to make sure that I'm crossing safely and not veering into traffic, especially with more and more electric vehicles with not as much sound. And it's not, and I want to be very clear when I say that I'm talking about quiet cars, not about the fact that they're electric, but about the fact that they're quiet. Be very clear on that point. So when you don't have a lot of those landmarks, having that can be really helpful, but it can also pose a challenge. So that is an environmental access conflict, and those occur often in space design and facility design. Another example that I often use to describe an access conflict is when I am booking a hotel. I will often say, you know, if I booked a hotel and I arrive to check in, I will often say, please do not give me the accessible room. And you might be thinking, why would you say very deliberately, please do not give me the accessible room? Because often when you have very large spaces, for me, for my own needs, I want to be able to know that in the middle of the night, if I need to use the restroom, I can find it very easily without having to navigate a very large space. That is another access conflict because, of course, I want there to be accessible facilities for everyone, including wheelchair users. I want accessible design. It is so critical. But sometimes what is accessible for one group is not accessible for another, or makes things harder. And I'm sure you can think about things in the reverse as well. I think about, for example, another way in which this shows up is, we know there have been some reports about this, and anybody with lived experience of disability can attest to this. Air travel is a nightmare, even on the best of circumstances. And so there are ways in which, because I am not a wheelchair user, and I'm using this simply as an example, there are plenty of other examples, but I want to kind of give over some concrete examples. Because I'm not a wheelchair user, there are ways in which I can access the plane far more easily, even though, as I've said, air travel is not a pleasant experience, and all the more so after the pandemic, or in the midst of the pandemic, I should say. So there are ways in which there are environmental conflicts. There are also ways in which there are conflicts that we don't often think about now that have arisen in the wake of the pandemic. And this is what I really want to focus on as something that I want us to be able to take away. So when we think about creating a building and a space and a community that everyone can feel able to be in, we have to think about, and I have to think a lot about, this is something that has been consuming a lot of my energy in the last few weeks, thinking about what does it mean to return to community and to be part of programming in a way that is maximally accessible and meets the most number of needs. And that is not something that one person or even a team can do on our own. This is the beauty of our tradition. There is an idea that Moses, our greatest prophet, there was one day when he was judging all these different cases that were coming to him, and people were kvetching and they were bringing a lot of complaints. And his father-in-law, Yitro, says to him, why are you taking on all of these cases? You're going to burn yourself out. You need to delegate. You need to have someone who is the head of 50 people and 10 people and such. You need to delegate your tasks. And therefore, after that experience, Moshe says, okay, I guess you're right about this. This is very good advice. Let me actually follow it and do that. And so he starts to delegate. And I'm noticing the times I'm going to try to be, I'm going to try to bring my formal piece to a close so that we can open up for Q&A. But I wanted to bring that up to say delegation is really important, and having someone who is bottom lining, that's a term that often gets used, who's really like the person to go to as holding the access portfolio, but who also is able to say, you know, this person handles this piece of it, this person handles that piece of it. And how do we grapple with access conflict when it inevitably arises? And I want to pause there and say inevitably, because it is an inevitability. Often in inclusion work, we think about, you know, we bring in all who want to find a home in our community, and what a beautiful thing that is. And that's our mandate. And that's ultimately what Negeshut is about. It's about that value from the very foundation of how do we make the space accessible. But the truth is, the reality is that there is often conflict between needs. And it is some of the hardest, most painful conflict, because nobody wants it. Nobody wants to have a situation in which people's needs are conflicting, and all the more so in the light of the COVID pandemic that we are living through, and in the light of the fact that many people with disabilities have been really impacted in ways that I believe we will be learning about for years to come. I don't think we're in any kind of normalcy for a while in terms of the mental health impact, the psychological impact. Now, that doesn't mean that any of us is an expert in any of that. I'm certainly not an expert, but what it does mean is that we have to take that into consideration. And I know in my own thinking about this, in my own consulting with others, in my own work, in my own communities, how my needs and how the needs of others around me often conflict with needs of folks who are higher risk. So, for example, creating a COVID safe space is really important for lots of people still, whether that is distancing, whether that is masking indoors, because many folks require that and it's important to do, whatever it is, right? Sometimes I have been in spaces, and I'm using this as an example, where I can feel like it can be challenging to know where to go, where to sit. How do I make sure I'm enough distance from folks? How do I make sure that, you know, I know that everyone around me is masked, whatever it is. It can be very challenging to still navigate. And I think something that I'm experiencing is that we are so many of us, and I include myself in this, by the way, right? so many of us want to go back to how it used to be. And I'm noticing that we are recreating the spaces that we used to have. So for example, this past Shabbat in synagogue, I went through the Kiddush buffet, which I had hoped that we would do Kiddush differently after COVID, because buffets for me as a blind person are really not my favorite thing, right? And I would have thought, oh, after COVID, we'd be doing it differently anyway, because there's so many reasons in which people wouldn't necessarily want to be in a buffet, right? But whatever it is, we so want to create that space. But I think we have this incredible opportunity to ask ourselves, how could we do this different and better? And simultaneously, how do we ensure that people do not feel left behind, because they already are? So what do we do? What is our responsibility as caring people to really show, not just tell, but show people that they matter to us, show people that they are not being abandoned. I think about this really crystallized for me a few weeks ago. I don't know if any of you saw these, but there were those clips. I heard them in a couple of podcasts and I had to turn it off. But there were some clips of folks cheering mid-flight when the mask mandate was lifted. And I know that folks in my community who are very significantly COVID at risk, that felt like a real stab in the gut, because it was like, oh, here we are being shown we do not matter. And so often people with disabilities, I think a lot of us feel like we're always on the outside trying to get in. And I think that we have this amazing opportunity now to show through our choices around programming, through our choices. I mean, we don't have limitless resources, right? We know that we are all struggling in the wake of this pandemic. We do not have limitless resources. We do not have limitless staff capacity. There are so many factors that we have to take into consideration. But within whatever we are able to do, how can we actually create a system that values and is actually accessible to as many people as we can? It doesn't mean that everything is going to be accessible to everyone. And that is really hard. I want to name that. That is really, really hard. And I want to live in a world in which that is not the case. I want to live in a world in which everything is accessible. But we're not there yet. So what do? We do our absolute best, and we prioritize communication and transparency. Those are the most important things. If we're thinking about how to avoid or how to minimize, I won't even say avoid, minimize and access conflict, communication and transparency are the most important things we can do. So I want to end there because I want to make sure we have some time, and I'm going to pass it back over to Sierra for some Q&A.
Rabbi Talkman, thank you so much. That was just so meaningful, and you shared such insight and important reflections with all of us. So thank you. I'm going to start by asking a question, and if anyone wants to throw questions in the chat while I do, please feel free to. And also, Beth and Naomi, I'm going to bring you back onto screen because you might have some answers to this question as well. You all have talked about the importance, and it's something we emphasize a lot at JCC Association as well, of centering people with lived experience, people with disabilities in the work around inclusion. And so Rabbi Talkman, I'll address this to you first, but how do you recommend for people who are on screen and who will listen to this recording in their communities to outreach to people with disabilities and lived experience to participate in conversations around inclusion in their JCCs? How do you make those connections if they're not already there, and start those conversations? If you have any advice for everyone.
That is the key. That is really the key question. How do you actually get that started if it's not already there? I would start with what you have. And through networks, I mean, I find in my own experience that, I mean, people reach out to me. I'm a little bit of a different case, of course, because I'm a rabbi and I'm a public figure. And so people know who I am and they reach out to me. And it's what I do professionally, right? So that in that case, I can engage, I can come into a space, I can, virtually or in person. But if you're thinking about just people who are in the community with disabilities, I would start with who you already are in community with, because everyone has networks, right? I would not necessarily, this is, you know, my perspective, and I eagerly would love to hear other perspectives. I would want to do it through a networked approach, especially in the wake of the pandemic, when people with disabilities are feeling so maxed out. I would not say to anyone, just cold call or reach out to a list. You might reach out to organizations. That would be a really good place to start. Organizations for people with disabilities, people with different disabilities, different synagogues you might be able to reach out to. I know that the JCCs serve the whole community, so you might reach out to spaces like that and let folks know. And there are publications that different organizations put out, and they have like different kinds of ads in them or different kinds of announcements of this kind. And that's one way that I would start, with inviting folks that you're already in relationship with to recommend people to you. This is something that I have done myself. And that can be really helpful, because then you're actually getting someone who has been recommended, someone who would be interested in the conversation, or would be interested in coming into the space.
Thank you. And Beth, do you have anything you want to add just from your own experience at your J?
Sure. I think that was wonderful advice and a great starting place. Here at our JCC, we originally created what was entitled a special needs committee. These were parents of children with disabilities who really were there to share their lived experience as parents and guide some of our programming and services. So that was a very big help to us in terms of learning and identifying the needs. We also engage frequently with staff that have disabilities for their feedback, teenagers when they're able to communicate that to us. So we do try to make availability for them and create opportunity to give their perspective and to share their experiences. Sometimes it's through surveys, sometimes it's through conversation. It depends on the group that we're working with at that time. But I think the key is just to make those opportunities available.
Perfect. Thank you, Beth. And Naomi, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I just want to echo what Beth said. So as I mentioned in my presentation, when we were looking at making changes to our facility, we decided to reach out to the community and intentionally ask for people to give us feedback and information. And so even starting that conversation really helps with continuing the conversation. Word spreads when people know that they want to be heard and that the messages they're delivering are being listened to. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Naomi. And we are just about out of time, so I will wrap here. Thank you so much, Rabbi Tuchman, Beth, and Naomi for being with us today, for sharing your insights, and for giving us all the opportunity to learn with you and from you. Again, to everyone on the call, I'll be sending up a follow-up email with the slide deck from all the presentations today, as well as a link to the recording. So if you have colleagues who are unable to join today and you want them to hear this presentation as well, you could share that link with them. And as always, thank you all for joining us. We look forward to continuing with the next webinar, which will be on June 14th at 1 p.m. Looking forward to seeing you all there. And again, thank you to our presenters today. Bye, everyone.